After my wife's funeral, I hid the second house from my son, and that single choice became the spark that set everything in motion. The air was still heavy with prayers, her memory lingering in every corner, yet within me a decision quietly formed that would shape the days ahead. What followed was not what anyone expected, and as time unfolded, the weight of that secret grew into a revelation my son never saw coming. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. I stood beside the casket, feeling the silence of a world that no longer had her laughter in it. And as people moved past with whispers of sympathy, I could barely hear them, for my mind was already torn between grief and something else entirely. My son stood across the room, his suit pressed sharp, his eyes scanning faces not with sorrow but with a calculation I knew all too well. The truth is that even before my wife passed, I had seen glimpses of this side of him, the side that measured love against numbers and sacrifice against inheritance. But that day confirmed it beyond question. As the hymns ended and relatives gathered in small groups, I felt the weight of eyes not on my wife's memory, but on me, the man left behind, with properties, accounts, and decisions to be made. My son walked toward me, his face solemn but his words already sharp, though he couched them in the tone of concern. He asked if I was all right, but beneath his question lay something colder, as though he were already tallying what remained. I nodded, not giving him the satisfaction of an answer, for deep in my chest a fire began to stir, one that my grief could not smother, the fire of resolve. My wife and I had worked for decades. We had bent our backs, worn out our hands, and carried one another through storms that would have broken weaker souls. We bought not one but two homes, not as trophies, but as anchors for the family we dreamed of building. And yet as I looked into my son's eyes, I knew he saw none of that. He saw only possession. He saw only entitlement. And so, while the scent of flowers lingered in the air and the earth outside waited to receive her, I made a choice. The second house would be hidden. It would be protected. It would never fall into the hands of a man who measured his parents' worth by the size of their estate. This decision was not made lightly. It came with the weight of a promise I had once whispered to my wife as we signed the papers for that very house. She had said to me, "This will keep us safe, no matter what comes." At the time I thought she meant storms or debts, but standing there at her funeral, I realized her words carried a deeper truth. The house would shield us even now, not from hardship, but from betrayal. As the day went on, I noticed how relatives spoke to one another, hushed tones carrying through the room. My son's name was whispered more than once. Some shook their heads. Others nodded knowingly. I caught fragments about assets, properties, inheritances, as though my wife's memory had already been eclipsed by speculation. My heart clenched, for this was not how I wanted her remembered, and yet it gave me clarity. In that very moment, the choice became more than survival. It became honor. To hide the second house was to preserve her legacy from the hands of greed, and though my son might rage in the days to come, he would not see it coming. That was the beginning. The moment when grief and resolve joined hands within me, setting me on a path that would change not just my life but his. What came after? No one could have predicted, not even me, but as I look back now, I see that the seed of it all was planted right there, beside her casket, where I vowed silently that our years of sacrifice would not be reduced to a ledger in my son's eyes. And that, my friends, is where the story truly begins. The day of mourning began with the slow toll of the church bells, each strike echoing through my bones as though they sought to remind me with cruel precision of the finality I was living. And as I stood there among black coats and lowered eyes, I felt as though the world had been stripped of all its color, for nothing shone as it once did without her by my side, and yet I had to stand tall as husband, father, and man left behind. The morning had been heavy with fog, the kind that clings to the streets and refuses to lift, and it matched perfectly the weight I carried in my chest. People filled the pews, their faces painted with polite sorrow, some genuine and some rehearsed, and though they bowed their heads when prayers were spoken, I knew that not every heart in that room was devoted to remembering her life. My eyes often wandered to my son, who sat near the front with his wife, his shoulders squared, his chin lifted just enough to show he was not crushed by grief, but calculating, his gaze drifting not to the casket, but to the few relatives who whispered near the back. When he caught my eye, he did not hold it with warmth. Instead, he offered a nod, the kind one gives in business rather than in shared mourning, and it cut through me sharper than any blade. I wanted to cry freely, to let the world see how broken I was. But I knew my tears would only fuel the whispers that were already circling. Whispers not of love lost, but of assets soon to be divided. The preacher spoke of her kindness, her devotion, her laughter that once lit every room, and though his words were sweet, they fell hollow against the silence of my son, who never once bowed his head in prayer. I thought of the nights when she and I had stayed awake, counting coins, planning bills, whispering of better days, and how we had found strength in each other, even when there was nothing left to hold but hope. Yet, as I sat there, I realized none of that seemed to matter to the one person who should have understood most. When the final hymn faded, people rose slowly, their eyes darting, some approaching me with practiced condolences, while others turned instead to him, asking questions about how he was holding up. Questions that seemed less about sorrow and more about certainty, as though they already assumed the mantle of responsibility had passed to him. I shook hands, nodded, thanked them for coming, all the while holding back the storm brewing in my chest. My daughter-in-law placed her hand on my son's arm, whispering something that made him smirk, a gesture so small, yet so revealing that I felt my blood run cold. This was not a day of remembrance for him, it was a day of transition, and he carried himself like a man awaiting the reading of terms, rather than the celebration of a life. Outside, the air was cold and sharp, the sky heavy with gray clouds that seemed unwilling to break, and as we walked to the graveside, I felt as though every step was carved into stone, not only because I was burying my wife, but because I was burying the illusion that my son would stand beside me in love. The coffin lowered slowly, the sound of earth striking the wood, a sound I will never forget, and while I bowed my head and whispered one last promise to her, my son stood rigid, his hands in his pockets, his eyes darting once more to the people gathered. He did not cry, he did not falter, he did not even whisper goodbye. Instead, he turned toward me when it was over and asked in the quietest voice, yet sharp enough to pierce the veil of grief, what would become of the houses now? I stared at him, my heart frozen, my hands trembling, for the truth of what he valued most was revealed in that instant. The day that should have been consumed by mourning had become a ledger in his mind, and while I walked away from the grave carrying sorrow, he walked away carrying expectation. The hours that followed the burial carried with them a strange quiet, not the comforting quiet of peace, but the kind that hums with tension just beneath the surface, And as I lingered near the hall where mourners gathered for a meal, I began to notice how the conversations drifted from kind words to hushed tones, how glances flickered toward me, and more often toward my son, who walked through the room with the air of a man already stepping into a role he believed was owed to him. I sat at the end of a long table, my plate untouched, my eyes heavy with the weight of tears I dared not shed in public, and though voices were low, I could hear enough to know the truth of their focus. They spoke of the house we lived in, the accounts my wife and I had built, and most of all the second house that few knew about but enough suspected existed. For whispers have a way of leaking through cracks even when we guard our secrets tightly. My son's name was repeated again and again, his wife's too, often paired with phrases like rightful heir and next in line, words that stung not because of their meaning but because of their timing. It had been only hours since the earth closed over my wife, yet here were men and women I had known for years, already calculating and speculating, as though my grief was less pressing than the shifting of wealth. I lowered my gaze, pretending to study the folds of a napkin, but my ears drank in every syllable, each one fueling a fire I could no longer deny. One cousin spoke of how my son was certain to take ownership of everything soon. Another remarked how my daughter-in-law would finally have the lifestyle she often bragged about desiring. And a third shook his head with a grin, saying how lucky my boy was to have parents who left him so well positioned. Not one spoke of the woman we had buried. Not one recalled her laughter, her selfless meals cooked on borrowed groceries, her hands calloused from endless work. Their tongues wagged not of her legacy of love, but of the numbers they imagined on paper. I turned my head slightly and saw my son at the far side of the hall, leaning close to an uncle, his voice low but his smile faint. The kind of smile that told me his thoughts were not about mourning, but about possession. My chest tightened, for I realized then that my choice to guard the second house was not just wise, it was necessary. My wife had warned me in her quiet way, always seeing more than I did, always reading people with sharper clarity. And though she never accused our son of greed, she often sighed when he pressed for help, whispering to me at night that perhaps we had given too freely, that perhaps he no longer saw us as parents, but as stepping stones. Now I heard it in the voices around me, the confirmation of her unspoken fears. They were all waiting for me to wither, waiting for me to hand over the fruits of decades, waiting for my son to step forward as the new master of all that was once ours. I pressed my hands together, steadying the tremor in my fingers, and told myself silently that I would not allow it. I thought of the late nights when she and I had stood in the kitchen with bills spread out before us, when she had taken my tired hands in hers and promised that the future we were building would be secure. I thought of how we had signed the deed to the second house with tears of relief, knowing we had carved out a piece of safety in a world that offered little, and I knew then that to expose it to greedy hands would be to betray her memory. The whispers grew softer as people noticed me watching, but the damage was done, their words etched in my mind like carvings on stone. My son returned to the table, his eyes avoiding mine, his tone casual as he asked whether I had eaten. And though his words seemed innocent, I heard the echo of the whispers behind them. This was no longer only about grief. This was a battle forming in shadows, and I knew it would soon step into the light. When the whispers of the mourners finally faded into the night and the house grew still, I sat alone in my chair and let my mind drift back through the years, not to the bitterness of what I had overheard, but to the moments that had built the very foundation of my life with her, moments of love and sacrifice that defined who we were, and why I would do anything to protect what remained. I remembered the first tiny apartment we called home, its walls thin enough to let in the noise of neighbors and the cold of winter. But in that space, we carved out joy with nothing more than laughter and dreams. She would work long shifts at the store while I carried crates at the factory, and though our backs ached and our pockets remained light, we never once complained, because every day brought us closer to the vision we shared of a home of our own. Nights were filled with simple meals, sometimes just bread and soup, but we would eat them with a sense of victory because they were earned together. I remembered the way she would trace plans on scraps of paper, drawing small boxes that represented rooms she wanted in the house we would someday buy, a kitchen big enough to hold family dinners, a living room filled with warmth, and a garden out back where she could plant flowers that would bloom every spring. It was her faith in those dreams that kept me moving when exhaustion threatened to crush me. I remembered the years of saving, the countless times we said no to pleasures so that we could say yes to progress, walking past shops filled with clothes we could not afford, skipping holidays that others celebrated, all for the chance to one day sign our names on a deed. When that day finally came and we bought our first house, it felt as though we had captured the sun itself, its light spilling into every corner of our lives. We stood in the empty living room with nothing but an old couch and a second-hand lamp, yet it was paradise to us. I saw her smile brighter than ever before, a smile that told me the sacrifices had been worth it. And though that first house became the place where our son grew up, where birthdays were celebrated and arguments softened into reconciliations, it was not the end of her dreams. She always believed in building a safety net, in never settling for comfort when security could be strengthened. So we worked even harder, carrying debts and burdens on our shoulders, always reminding ourselves that the effort was not for us alone but for the family that would follow. Years passed, and the second house became reality, a small but solid place tucked away, bought with sweat and perseverance. And the day we signed those papers, she took my hand and whispered that now we could rest a little easier. That second house was not just property. It was her vision of protection, her proof that all those nights of hunger and exhaustion had meaning. As I sat in the quiet after her funeral, I replayed those memories with painful clarity. And I felt the sting of betrayal sharper than ever when I thought of how our son dismissed those sacrifices as though they were nothing more than stepping stones for his own comfort. He had never seen her crying over bills late at night, never watched her hands crack from scrubbing floors to save a few more coins, never stayed up with me as we wondered if the electricity would hold out until the next paycheck. He only saw the end result, the houses, the accounts, the stability, and he mistook them for gifts handed down instead of the hard-earned rewards of decades of love and endurance. That was why I could not give him everything without thought. That was why the second house had to be hidden. It was not simply about protecting bricks and mortar. It was about protecting her memory, about ensuring that the life we built together did not end as a footnote in his ledger of greed. As the night grew darker, I closed my eyes and let the warmth of those memories wrap around me, a reminder that every step we took, every sacrifice we made had meaning, and I swore once more that I would not let it all be squandered. As I sat alone in the silence of the house, the memories of love and sacrifice that had once filled me with warmth soon gave way to recollections of moments that revealed the shadows growing in my son. Moments I had tried to ignore or excuse, but which now returned with a sharp clarity that pierced through my grief, for I realized that the signs of his greed had been present all along, and I, blinded by a father's hope, had chosen to look away. I remembered when he was a boy, asking for coins not to buy food or toys of simple joy, but to flaunt before his classmates, proud not of what he earned but of what he demanded. And though I laughed it off then, telling myself that all children had phases of selfishness, The unease lingered in my chest. As he grew older, the requests grew larger, and they were no longer requests, but expectations spoken with the certainty of someone who believed he was entitled. Tuition fees that I scraped together with my wife's help were accepted without gratitude, as though they were debts owed rather than sacrifices made. When we struggled to cover those costs, he never asked how he could help, never offered to work part-time, never thought to lighten the load. Instead, he would shrug, certain that we would find a way, because in his eyes we always would. I remembered the first time he called me not to ask how I was, but to ask for money to cover a debt he had carelessly created, his voice impatient when I hesitated, his words sharp as if my reluctance was an insult to him. I paid it, of course, telling myself that it was better to save him from shame than to teach him a harsh lesson, and yet even then I felt the sting of his disregard. When I offered advice, he brushed it off. When I warned him of the dangers of living beyond his means, he laughed and told me I was stuck in the past. My wife, gentle as she was, often tried to remind him of the value of hard work, but he would roll his eyes, dismissing her wisdom with a casual arrogance that wounded her more than she admitted. I could still see the look in her eyes after he left one evening. Having asked for more money with little more than a grunt of thanks, her expression filled with quiet sorrow as she whispered that he no longer saw us as parents, but as a bank. At the time, I argued, telling her not to be so harsh, convincing myself that he would change with age, that maturity would teach him the lessons we could not force upon him, but deep down, I feared she was right. His greed revealed itself not only in money, but in the way he viewed possessions. For when we bought the second house, he did not congratulate us or marvel at our perseverance, but asked immediately what portion would one day be his. He never asked how many nights we had gone without sleep to earn it, never asked how many meals we had skipped to save. He only asked about his share. The word struck me then, though I hid my disappointment behind a smile. For I did not want to admit that the boy I raised had grown into a man who measured worth only in ownership. Later, when he married, the signs grew sharper still, his wife's voice often joining his in subtle but pointed comments about what we should do with our properties, about how the younger generation needed to step in and take responsibility, words coated in politeness but dripping with expectation. I began to see how his arrogance was not born in isolation, but nurtured, reinforced, encouraged by those around him who saw our sacrifices, not as a legacy, but as an inheritance waiting to be seized. Looking back now, I realized that every hint was a warning. Every demand was a clue, every careless dismissal was a sign, and yet I ignored them, telling myself that beneath it all he still carried love, that gratitude would one day bloom in his heart. But sitting here in the quiet, with the echo of the funeral still fresh in my mind, I know the truth I once refused to face. The early signs of greed were never fleeting, they were the foundation of who he had chosen to become, and it was my failure to see them clearly that led us to the battle I must now fight. It was only days after we laid her to rest, when the weight of my son's intentions revealed itself without disguise, for he came to me not with tenderness or concern, but with a bluntness that carried no trace of mourning. And in that moment, the first demand was made. A demand that shattered any fragile hope I still carried, that he might rediscover the love and gratitude of a son. I remember the hour clearly. The house still heavy with her absence, her chair untouched, her scent lingering faintly in the air. And there he was, standing in the doorway, with his arms crossed and his eyes sharp, his words delivered as though he were a lawyer presenting terms. He did not ask how I was coping, did not ask whether I was eating or sleeping, did not speak of her with reverence. Instead, he spoke of the properties, his tone clipped and efficient, as though emotion had no place in his conversation. He said it was time to speak practically, that arrangements needed to be discussed, that it was important for him to know the details of the houses now that Mother was gone. I listened in silence, my chest heavy, my hands gripping the arm of my chair, because every word he spoke sounded less like a question and more like a claim. He asked about the title of the first house, whether it was fully under my name, whether there were debts still tied to it, whether I had considered transferring it sooner rather than later to save time. He spoke of efficiency, of management, of clarity, words that seemed professional but which carried within them the coldness of entitlement. I thought of how my wife would have looked at him in that moment, her eyes wide with disappointment, her voice trembling with sorrow, for this was not the son we had raised to value family above fortune. When I remained quiet, he grew impatient, his tone sharpening as he asked about the second house, the one few knew existed. He did not know its exact details, yet his assumption was clear. He believed it must belong to him now as well. I looked at him then, really looked, and I saw not grief but eagerness, not loss but hunger, and the silence between us grew so heavy I thought it might crush me. I answered carefully, reminding him that his mother had only just been buried, that we needed time to honor her memory before we spoke of such matters, but he brushed my words aside with a wave of his hand, telling me that sentiment was for the past and that the future needed to be managed. The sting of his dismissal cut deep, for in his eyes my mourning was an obstacle, my grief an inconvenience delaying his inheritance. He left the room soon after, not with the embrace of comfort, but with the stiff stride of a man dissatisfied with an unfinished deal. And as I sat there alone, I felt my heart split in two, one half heavy with sorrow for my wife, and the other burning with a resolve I had not known I possessed. For in that first demand, spoken so coldly and so soon, I understood that there was no space for patience, no hope for change, no chance that he would awaken to the truth of love and sacrifice. He had revealed his hand, and in doing so, he had given me clarity. I realized that my silence, my hesitations, my desire to preserve peace had only fed his arrogance, and now it was time to protect what was left, not for him, but for her, not for greed, but for honor. The first demand was not only a question about houses, it was a declaration of war, and though I did not answer him that day, I knew that my response would not be spoken in words, but in actions that he would never anticipate. That night after his visit, when the echo of his first demand still rang in my ears and the silence of the house seemed colder than it had ever been, I sat in my chair and felt the weight of a decision pressing down on me, a decision that I knew would shape the course of everything that came after, and that was the moment I reached the turning point. The grief of losing her had already hollowed me, but his words that day carved away the last fragile hope that remained within me, leaving only clarity. I realized that if I did nothing, if I simply allowed events to unfold as he expected, then all that she and I had built together would be consumed by his arrogance, reduced to a prize to flaunt rather than a legacy to honor. I could see her face in my mind as vividly as if she were still beside me, her eyes filled with quiet strength, her smile soft but resolute, and I heard her voice reminding me of the many nights we had sacrificed, the many dreams we had postponed, the many burdens we had carried together for the sake of our future. She would never forgive me if I allowed it all to slip into the careless hands of our son without a fight. So as I sat there in the dim glow of the lamp, my fingers tapping against the armrest as though urging me forward, I made a choice that felt both heavy and liberating. The second house would be hidden, not just ignored or delayed, but secured in such a way that no greedy hand could touch it, no entitled heir could claim it, no careless decision could erase what she and I had built. This was not a choice of anger, but of honor. Not a refusal, but a defense. Not for me alone, but for the woman whose memory deserved more than to be overshadowed by the hunger of her own child. My heart pounded with a mixture of fear and resolve, for I knew the road ahead would not be simple. And yet the decision gave me a strange peace, as though a path had been cleared in a forest of grief. For the first time since her funeral, I felt a purpose stronger than sorrow. I thought back to the early signs, the whispered conversations, the first demand, and I realized they had all been leading to this moment. Perhaps this was why life had tested us so harshly, why we had struggled so long to secure what we did. Because in the end it was not just about giving, but about protecting, not just about sacrifice, but about wisdom. I looked around the room and saw her chair, her scarf still draped across it, her presence lingering in every detail, and I whispered aloud the promise I had once made to her, that I would always safeguard what we built. My voice trembled, but my resolve did not. I told her that I would not let our son's greed tarnish her memory, that I would fight in silence if I must, that I would stand alone if I must, but I would not falter. In that vow, I felt her with me again, as though her spirit reached out and steadied my hand, urging me to move forward without fear. I knew then that the man who had walked into my home demanding answers was not the same boy we had once carried on our shoulders. He was someone changed by entitlement, blinded by pride, and if he could not see the value of our sacrifices, then he would have to learn through the consequences of his own arrogance. The turning point was not loud. It did not come with shouts or anger. It came in the stillness of a quiet night, in the resolve of an old man sitting alone, yet feeling less alone than ever, because he carried within him the strength of his wife's memory and the determination of a life lived with purpose. From that moment forward, I knew my course was set, and though storms would rise, I would not be moved. The morning after I made my silent vow, I rose with a sense of purpose that had not stirred in me for many days, and though my body ached from sleepless nights and the weight of sorrow still clung to me like a shroud, my mind carried a clarity that pushed me forward. For I knew that if I was to protect the second house and honor the legacy my wife and I had built, I would need more than resolve. I would need the wisdom of law to shield it from greedy hands. And so I decided it was time to consult a professional. The streets felt colder that day, as though the world itself wanted to test my strength, yet I walked steadily toward the office of a lawyer I had known by reputation, a man respected for his sharpness and discretion. The waiting room smelled faintly of polished wood and ink, and as I sat there with documents tucked beneath my arm, I thought of how strange it was to be here so soon after laying my wife to rest, not to settle her affairs, but to protect them. When my name was called, and I entered his office, the air grew heavier with the scent of old books and quiet authority. He shook my hand firmly, his eyes studying me not as a grieving old man but as a client with a matter of weight. I told him everything, my voice steady though my heart pounded, explaining how my wife and I had bought the second house as a shield for our future, how my son had shown signs of greed even before she passed, and how his first demand had revealed to me the danger of leaving the house vulnerable. The lawyer listened carefully, his pen resting still upon the desk, his expression one of measured understanding, and when I finished, he leaned forward and said that I was wise to come now rather than later. He explained that properties left in plain sight could be claimed or contested, that a man blinded by entitlement could twist even the simplest arrangements into weapons of demand, but with careful steps, the second house could be safeguarded, placed fully under my control, invisible to those who sought to take it before its time. His words filled me with both relief and sorrow, for it was a comfort to know the law could shield me, yet a pain to accept that I must shield myself from my own son. He laid out options, speaking of trusts, transfers, and legal protections that could not easily be challenged, each word sinking into my mind like stones into a river, steady and unavoidable. I signed where he instructed, each stroke of the pen feeling like a blade severing the thread that tied my son's expectations to the house. As the papers stacked higher, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders, though it was replaced with a different burden, the knowledge that secrecy would now be my companion. I looked out the window of his office, the city alive with people rushing about their lives, and I thought of my wife, of how she would smile at my determination, of how she would nod approvingly, knowing that what we had built would not be squandered. The lawyer assured me that once the arrangements were completed, the second house would be secured beyond the reach of anyone who sought it through arrogance or force, and I thanked him with a gratitude that words could barely carry. As I left his office, papers sealed in an envelope beneath my arm, I walked with a new steadiness, not because the battle was over, but because I had armed myself for the war ahead. I knew my son would grow impatient, that he would press harder, that he would test my resolve with sharper words and stronger demands. But I also knew that I now carried a shield he could not pierce. That day marked the beginning of my silent preparations, the moment when my private vow became a lawful reality. And though my heart still ached for the loss of my wife, I felt her presence with me, guiding my steps, whispering that I was doing what was right. Consulting the professional was not merely a transaction, it was the first true defense of our legacy, and I left that office with the certainty that no matter how cunning my son might believe himself to be, he would never see what came next. In the weeks that followed my visit to the lawyer, I began to notice a change in the way my son carried himself, a shift so bold and so telling that I could not ignore it. For his growing arrogance was no longer confined to whispered conversations or subtle demands. It had become the very air around him, thick with entitlement and expectation, and it was then that I realized how blind he had become to the truth that not everything in this life can be claimed simply because one desires it. He walked into my home with the gait of a man who believed himself already master of all he surveyed, his eyes darting across the rooms as though measuring their worth, his tone sharpened with the confidence of someone who thought he had already won. He spoke to me not as a son to a father, but as though I were an old caretaker, someone holding on to what rightfully belonged to him until he saw fit to take it. His words were draped in politeness when others were near, but when we were alone the mask slipped, and I saw the smirk, the impatience, the thinly veiled contempt that had grown since the funeral. He began boasting to relatives and friends. I heard it through the steady hum of family gossip, how soon he would have both houses under his control, how he and his wife would renovate, rent, and expand, how his life was about to ascend to a level of comfort he had always deserved. Those words spread like wildfire, whispered back to me by cousins and neighbors who thought I should know, and though they struck me like barbs, they also strengthened my resolve. For I knew that his pride was building him a pedestal from which his fall would be all the greater. I noticed how his wife fanned the flames, her laughter ringing loud when he bragged, her encouragement woven into every word she whispered in his ear. And together they created an image of ownership long before a single deed had changed hands. At gatherings, he spoke of the houses as though they were already his, ignoring my presence, his voice swelling with the arrogance of certainty. When I confronted him gently, reminding him that nothing had been transferred, that matters of inheritance required patience and respect, he laughed softly, telling me that I was too cautious, that the family already saw him as the rightful heir, that it was only a matter of time. He leaned closer once and said with a smile that I should not trouble myself with decisions, for he would soon handle everything. Those words struck me harder than I let him see, and though my heart ached at the loss of the bond we once shared, I steeled myself in silence. His arrogance blinded him, and he could not see the walls I had quietly built around the second house, walls stronger than any demand or boast. As the weeks passed, I watched him grow bolder, telling his friends of future plans, making promises to in-laws, speaking of renovations that would never happen. He wore his arrogance like armor, confident that no one could pierce it, not knowing that beneath his very feet the ground was already shifting. His certainty gave him away, his blindness betrayed him, and each word he spoke only deepened the chasm that divided us. I saw the way others began to look at him, some with admiration, others with unease. Yet he noticed none of it, for in his mind he was already victor. I remained silent, offering no correction, no explanation, no hint of the truth, for I knew that the greater his arrogance swelled, the more devastating would be the lesson when it finally broke. And as I sat in the quiet of my home each evening, holding the documents that secured the second house, I felt both sorrow and satisfaction. Sorrow that my son had allowed arrogance to consume him, satisfaction that in time he would learn a truth he could neither deny nor escape. As the days turned into weeks and the arrogance of my son grew more visible, I began to see with painful clarity the hand that guided and encouraged much of it, for it was not only his own pride that blinded him, but also the influence of his wife, a woman whose words dripped with flattery when spoken to me, but whose whispers to him carried the poison of ambition. And it was through her encouragement that his entitlement grew into something even more dangerous. I had known from the beginning that she was a woman who measured worth in possessions, her eyes always lingering on what others owned, her conversation sprinkled with envy and desire. Yet I hoped that marriage might soften her, that love might temper her hunger, but instead it seemed to have sharpened it, for she found in my son not a partner to cherish, but a vessel through which her own ambitions could be realized. I recall one afternoon when they visited, her smile bright and her words sweet as she praised the home my wife and I had built. But when she thought I was out of earshot, I heard her urging him to press me harder, telling him that it was time for the younger generation to step in, that he had waited long enough, that the properties were wasted under my care. Her voice carried not affection but calculation, and in his eager nods I saw how deeply her influence had sunk into him. At family gatherings she would nudge him when conversations turned to inheritance, her eyes gleaming as though she could already see herself draped in the luxury she believed awaited her. She encouraged his boasts, laughing at his arrogance, clapping softly at his confidence, feeding the illusion that he was destined to take control. In her presence he seemed taller, louder, more brazen, as though her approval fueled his every word, and I realized that alone he might have been more hesitant, more patient, but with her at his side he felt invincible. I could not fault him entirely, for love can blind as surely as pride, and yet I could not forgive the way she twisted that love into a weapon, turning him against the very values we had raised him with. My wife had seen it too, long before her final days, and though she never spoke harshly, I noticed the way her eyes dimmed whenever our daughter-in-law pressed for gifts or hinted at expectations. She once confided in me late at night that she feared the woman cared more for what we could provide than for the bond of family, and though I had brushed aside her worries then, now I knew they had been well-founded. The influence of that woman reached further than I wished to admit, for it was not only in words but in the subtle reshaping of his attitude, the way he began to look at me not as a father but as an obstacle, the way he carried himself with the certainty of someone being cheered from the sidelines. She had woven herself into his ambition so tightly that he no longer separated her desires from his own, and together they created a vision of a future built not on gratitude or patience, but on conquest. I watched them carefully, saying little, for every word I might have spoken in warning would only have been twisted into proof that I was withholding what they believed was theirs. Instead, I listened, observed, and strengthened my resolve, knowing that their growing arrogance would only make the moment of truth more powerful. The daughter-in-law's influence was a storm behind him, pushing him forward with force, and though he thought himself strong, he was only being carried by her winds. Yet storms, no matter how fierce, always break. And as I looked at them together, I knew their confidence would one day crumble when faced with the truth I had hidden. As I sat alone in the quiet of the evening, the echoes of their voices still lingering in my ears, I found myself drifting back through the years, to the days when my son was small, to the countless moments of fatherhood that had once filled me with pride and purpose, and though those memories now carried the sting of ingratitude, I could not deny the truth of all that I had given. For fatherhood is not a ledger to be balanced, but a journey carved out of sacrifice, patience, and love. I remembered the first time I held him in my arms, his tiny hands curling around my finger as if to anchor himself in this world, and in that instant I swore silently to provide for him, to shield him, to give him a life stronger and safer than the one I had inherited. I remembered the sleepless nights when his cries pierced the darkness, when my wife and I took turns rocking him, whispering promises into his ear that he would never know hunger, never know the despair that had shadowed our own childhoods. I remembered the mornings when I left for work with tired eyes, carrying on my shoulders not only the weight of machinery, but also the hope that each shift brought me one step closer to building a future worthy of him. As the years passed, I watched him take his first steps across the worn floor of our small home, each stumble filling me with both fear and pride, and I carried him on my shoulders through markets, through festivals, through the long walks to school, telling him stories of resilience and honor, believing he would grow to cherish those lessons. I remembered the school fees that arrived like storms each year, threatening to drown us, yet my wife and I always found a way, skipping meals, patching clothes, selling belongings, because his education was a promise we refused to break. I remembered the times when he came home asking for money for trips or supplies, and though my pockets were often empty, I would find a way to place a few bills in his hands, not because I could afford it, but because I wanted him to feel no shame among his peers. I remembered the debts we cleared for him when he was older, debts that he created through carelessness, and how my wife and I whispered in the night about whether we had made a mistake by rescuing him too often, whether our generosity had blinded him to the cost of sacrifice. Yet even then, I told myself that this was what fathers did, that no matter how heavy the burden, a father carried it gladly. I remembered his milestones. The graduation where my eyes filled with tears, though he never once looked toward us in gratitude. The wedding where my wife and I gave more than we could afford to help him start his life, and how his new bride accepted it with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Every moment of fatherhood had been a step along a road paved with sacrifices, each one chosen willingly. And yet, as I sat in the silence of my home after her passing, I felt the sharp truth that he had never seen those sacrifices as love, but as obligations. My heart ached with the weight of it, for I had hoped that one day he would look back and realize all that had been done for him, that he would honor the labor and the tears that built his comfort. But instead he stood before me with demands, his heart hardened by entitlement. Still, even in that ache, the memories themselves shone brightly, for they reminded me not of his failures, but of our perseverance, of the love my wife and I poured into him even when it left us empty. Those memories of fatherhood, though now shadowed by sorrow, gave me strength, because they told me that my sacrifices had meaning even if he could not see it. And they reminded me that to protect what we built was not selfishness but duty, for fatherhood does not end with providing. It continues in safeguarding the legacy of love and labor from those who would squander it. The day came when my son no longer cloaked his desires in politeness or hinted at his expectations through suggestion, for he stood before me with a stern face and a voice sharpened by arrogance, and delivered what he called a truth, but what I knew to be nothing less than an ultimatum. And in that moment, the last fragile thread between us was tested to the point of breaking. He arrived unannounced, his footsteps heavy across the floor, his wife trailing close behind with that same approving smirk that had always fueled his boldness. And he wasted no time in circling the conversation back to the matter of property, of houses, of what he declared was rightfully his. He told me that he had been patient long enough, that the family expected clarity, that the assets needed to be consolidated, and that as his father I should step aside and allow him to take control. His words struck like stones, each one heavier than the last, for they carried not a trace of gratitude, not a shred of love, but only the certainty of entitlement. He accused me of holding on to things that no longer belonged to me, of being selfish in my grief, of dishonoring the memory of my wife by refusing to pass on what she had left behind. My heart pounded as he spoke, not with fear, but with sorrow. For I realized that the son I had carried, raised, and sacrificed for now looked at me as though I were an obstacle standing in the way of his comfort. He leaned closer, his voice dropping lower, sharper, telling me that I had two choices: to hand over the houses willingly or to face the consequences of what he described as inevitable. His wife chimed in, her tone dripping with practiced sweetness but her words cold, saying that it was only natural for the younger generation to take over, that I had done enough, that I should rest and let them enjoy what was theirs. I sat in my chair, my hands gripping the armrest so tightly I thought the wood might crack, my chest heavy with the weight of betrayal. And yet in that moment something within me hardened into steel. I thought of the nights of sacrifice, of the debts cleared, of the meals skipped, of the countless hours of labor poured into building the life he so casually dismissed as his by right, and I knew that this was not a matter of selfishness, but of respect, of legacy, of honor. I told him in a quiet voice that the houses were not prizes to be claimed, that they were built on blood, sweat, and sacrifice, and that they carried with them a weight he did not yet understand. He scoffed, waving my words aside as though they were the ramblings of an old man clinging to the past, and repeated his ultimatum with sharper force, telling me that time was running out and that he would not ask again. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, and I felt the truth settle over me like a mantle. There was no longer any hope of reconciliation. No longer any possibility that he would awaken to gratitude, for he had chosen his path, and it was one paved in greed. His ultimatum was not a plea, it was a challenge. And though he thought he had cornered me, he did not know that I had already taken steps to secure what he sought. As he left that day, his words still echoing in the air, I felt the ache of sorrow, but also the steady beat of resolve, for his ultimatum had not broken me, it had solidified me. He believed he had forced my hand, but in truth he had only confirmed that I was right to protect the second house, right to shield the fruits of our labor, right to honor the memory of my wife in the only way left to me. The ultimatum was his weapon, but it would become the very spark that ignited the lesson he would never forget. That night after my son left, his ultimatum still echoing in the hollow of my home, I sat in the dim light of the lamp and felt a chill settle deep within me. Not the chill of fear or despair, but something far stronger. A cold resolve that wrapped itself around my heart and steadied my spirit. For I knew with certainty that from this moment forward there could be no wavering, no hesitation, no lingering hope that he might turn back toward gratitude or respect, only the unyielding truth that I must protect what remained at all costs. The words he had thrown at me played again and again in my mind. His voice filled with entitlement, his accusations of selfishness, his claim that I dishonored her memory by refusing to hand him everything, and each word fanned the fire within me, not of anger but of determination. I thought of my wife, of her gentle hands holding mine in the darkest nights, of her laughter ringing through the modest home we once shared, of her faith that our sacrifices would mean something lasting, and I whispered to her, as though she were still seated across from me, that I would not falter, that I would not betray her trust, that I would not allow our son to reduce her life's work into a ledger of assets. The resolve I carried was cold, because it no longer held the warmth of illusion, no longer softened itself with the hope that love alone could fix what greed had broken. It was a resolve, sharpened by betrayal, hardened by necessity, clear as glass and strong as steel. I rose from my chair and walked slowly through the house, my hand brushing across the photographs on the walls, each frame holding a memory of love, of family, of moments that should have bound us together forever. And I felt both the sorrow of their fading meaning and the power of their reminder, for those memories belonged to me and to her, not to him who dismissed them so carelessly. The rooms seemed different now, not just spaces of grief, but fortresses of purpose, each one whispering that it was time to act, time to prepare, time to face the storm that was gathering with the calm strength of a man who had nothing left to lose, but everything to protect. I sat once more at the table where she and I had so often planned our future, spread out the papers the lawyer had given me, and studied them with a clarity I had never known. Every word, every clause, every signature represented not just legality but defiance, a shield forged against arrogance. And as I traced the ink with my finger, I felt the cold resolve settle even deeper, anchoring me so firmly that nothing my son could say or do would move me. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, the world dark and silent, but within me there was no fear, only certainty. I knew he would return with sharper words, with louder demands, perhaps even with threats, but none of it would matter, for I was no longer the grieving father he thought he could manipulate. I was the guardian of a legacy, the protector of a promise, and I would see it through to the very end. I whispered once more into the quiet, telling my wife that I loved her, that I missed her, that I would honor her. And though no answer came, I felt her presence in the steadiness of my breath, in the firmness of my hands, in the unshakable calm that now filled me. The cold resolve was not cruelty. It was clarity, the kind that comes when every path but one has been closed, and I embraced it fully, knowing that the battle ahead would test me, but also knowing that I had already chosen victory the moment I decided to protect the second house. The days that followed were marked by a silence that to others may have seemed like mourning, but within that silence I was working with purpose, for I had stepped beyond hesitation and into a stage of deliberate action. And though my son carried on with his arrogance and his wife whispered more poison into his ear, I moved quietly through my preparations. Each step taken with the patience of a man who knew that the greatest strength often lies not in loud declarations, but in silent resolve. I rose each morning with the same ritual, brewing my coffee, sitting at the table, spreading out documents that I reviewed with the steady hand of someone who had nothing left to prove but everything left to protect. I organized bank accounts, cross-checked statements, and ensured that every cent was where it needed to be, untouchable and secured. I revisited the documents from the lawyer, reading them until every clause became etched into my memory, until I could close my eyes and see the fortress that had been built around the second house in the form of ink and law. I sorted through old papers, deeds, receipts, letters, and as I filed them carefully into folders, I realized that every scrap of paper told a story, each one a fragment of the life my wife and I had fought for. And I took comfort in the order I was creating, knowing that chaos could not breach a fortress so carefully arranged. When relatives called to check in, I spoke little, my words polite but distant, for I knew that every conversation carried the risk of being repeated back to my son, and I refused to give him even a whisper of the truth. I learned to let silence become my ally, answering questions with nods, letting pauses stretch long enough to discourage further inquiry. In the evenings I walked through the house, checking locks, setting aside heirlooms that carried meaning not in money but in memory, and I placed them in places only I would know, for I did not want even those to be snatched by greedy hands. At night, when the house was dark and still, I sat in my chair and rehearsed in my mind the coming confrontation, not with anger, but with calm, reminding myself that patience would be my weapon, that I would not rise to his bait, that I would hold steady until the truth revealed itself in a way he could not deny. Silent preparation also meant preparing my own heart, and that was perhaps the hardest task of all. I spent long hours reflecting on the life I had lived, on the love I had shared with my wife, on the sacrifices that had defined our journey, and I reminded myself again and again that what I was doing was not out of spite but out of loyalty. It was for her, for us, for the dream we had carried together, and for the respect that legacy deserved. There were moments when the loneliness weighed heavily, when I longed for her presence to reassure me, but in those moments I looked to her photograph and found strength in her eyes. I told her softly that I was preparing, that I was steady, that I was ready, and though the room gave no answer, my heart felt hers beating with mine. Each day I grew more certain, more calm, more ready, and though to the outside world I was simply an old man lost in his grief, within me there was a storm of preparation building, quiet but unstoppable. Silent preparation was not weakness. It was strength disguised, and I carried it like armor, invisible yet unbreakable, knowing that soon the time would come when all would be revealed, and my son would learn the lesson his arrogance had hidden from him. The day finally arrived when silence would no longer be enough, when the preparations I had made in solitude would have to stand against the arrogance of my son in the open light. And that moment came not in the quiet of my home, but in the public setting of the lawyer's office, a place where walls of books and polished wood carried the weight of authority and truth, and it was there that our paths converged with the certainty of fate. I remember walking into that room with a calm that surprised even me, my hand steady, my breath even, for though my heart carried grief, it also carried resolve, and I had already accepted that whatever storm would break within those walls, I was ready to face it. My son was already there, seated beside his wife, his posture smug, his smile thin but triumphant, and the way he looked at me told me that he believed the day would end with his victory. His wife whispered something in his ear, and they both shared a laugh too soft for others to hear. But I caught it, and I knew it was another reminder of their confidence, of the life they imagined awaiting them once the papers were signed and the titles transferred. Around the table sat a handful of relatives who had come not out of necessity but out of curiosity, eager to witness what they assumed would be the moment of transition, the passing of wealth from father to son. The lawyer entered with measured steps, carrying a folder thick with documents, his eyes sharp yet calm, and the room fell into silence as he placed the folder upon the table. He greeted us each politely, but when he looked at me there was a subtle nod, a quiet acknowledgement of the preparation we had done in secret, and in that glance I felt a surge of strength. My son leaned forward, tapping his fingers impatiently, his voice breaking the silence as he declared that it was time to settle matters once and for all, his tone brimming with authority, as though he were already the master of what he sought. The lawyer opened the folder and began to read, his words clear, his tone firm, outlining the details of the estate, the accounts, the arrangements left behind. At first, my son nodded confidently, his smile widening as each line seemed to confirm what he believed. But as the lawyer continued, his expression began to falter, for the details were not as simple as he expected. The first house was addressed, its ownership explained, its security under my name made clear, and murmurs rippled through the relatives as the certainty of an immediate transfer began to crumble. My son shifted in his seat, his wife's hand tightening on his arm, but they said nothing as the lawyer pressed on. Then came the mention of the second house, the very property my son had boasted of to friends, the prize he had spoken of as though already his, and the lawyer's words sliced through the air with precision. The second house, he explained, had been secured fully under my sole control, protected by legal arrangements that left no room for challenge, invisible to claims of inheritance, shielded beyond the reach of entitlement. A hush fell over the room, heavy and palpable, and I saw my son's face drain of color, his mouth opening but no words coming forth, his arrogance collapsing in the span of a breath. Relatives exchanged glances, some with surprise, others with quiet satisfaction, and the silence that followed was louder than any outburst. I sat still, my hands folded, my gaze steady, offering no triumph, no anger, only calm, for I knew the moment spoke for itself. The lawyer closed the folder with finality, his voice calm as he explained that all arrangements were lawful, binding, and complete, and that nothing more was required from me or from anyone else. My son tried to protest, his words stumbling, his wife whispering frantically beside him, but the lawyer silenced them with a firm tone, reminding them that what was done could not be undone. In that public setting, the truth stood naked, undeniable, unshakable, and for the first time I saw the beginning of cracks in his arrogance. I remained silent, for silence was my victory. And as the room shifted with the weight of revelation, I knew that the path I had chosen in grief and resolve had led to this moment of undeniable clarity. The air in the lawyer's office grew heavier as the moment of truth arrived. And though my son still carried himself with the posture of confidence, I could see the flicker of unease in his eyes as the lawyer began to lay bare the details that had been hidden from him. For this was the reveal that would shatter his illusions and strip away the arrogance he had worn like armor for so long. The lawyer spoke clearly, his words slow and deliberate, as he unfolded the documents that confirmed the second house had been placed under protection so firm that no hand but mine could touch it, no demand could sway it, no claim could pierce it. My son leaned forward, his brow furrowing, his smile fading as he realized that the path he thought was paved before him was blocked by walls higher than he had ever imagined. His wife's face paled, her whispers sharp in his ear, urging him to challenge, to protest. But the lawyer silenced them with the weight of law, pointing to each signature, each clause, each seal that bound the property beyond their reach. The relatives who had gathered leaned closer, some murmuring in surprise, others shaking their heads, and though no one spoke loudly, I could feel the shift in the room as admiration and expectation turned into discomfort and disappointment. My son's voice finally broke through the silence, rising in disbelief, asking how such an arrangement could exist, how I could have done this without his knowledge, how the house could be locked away when it was meant, in his mind, to be his. His words cracked with anger, but beneath the fury was the tremor of fear, the fear of realizing that he had built his pride upon assumptions that no longer stood. I remained seated, calm and quiet, my hands folded before me, for I did not need to raise my voice or defend myself. The documents themselves were the defense, the truth laid out in ink that could not be erased. The lawyer's tone never shifted, never softened, and with each explanation my son's confidence crumbled further, his arrogance dissolving into a frantic disbelief. His wife tried to intervene, her voice sweetened with false courtesy as she asked whether there was room for reconsideration, whether adjustments could be made, but the lawyer's eyes sharpened as he reminded her that the matter was closed, finalized, and beyond contest. The reveal was not only in the papers but in the faces around the room, for I saw the relatives who had whispered his name now looking at him with unease, saw the admiration that once fed his arrogance replaced by quiet judgment, saw the truth sink into every corner of the space until even he could not deny it. My heart, though heavy with sorrow, felt a surge of quiet strength, for I knew that I had honored my wife's memory by protecting the home we had built, and I knew that this moment was the culmination of every silent preparation, every cold resolve, every sacrifice that had led me here. My son tried one last time, his voice louder, his words sharper, accusing me of betrayal, of cruelty, of dishonor, but the weight of his accusations only revealed his blindness, for the truth stood before him unshakable. I did not rise, I did not shout, I did not even answer, for silence was more powerful than anything I could say. And as he raged against the documents, against the lawyer, against me, the room itself turned against him, the judgment of family and the authority of law binding him tighter than chains. The reveal was complete, not with spectacle but with certainty, and though my son had walked into that office believing he would leave triumphant, he instead sat in the shadow of his own arrogance, staring at a truth he could neither change nor control. The silence that followed the lawyer's words seemed to stretch across the room like an ocean, deep and endless, and in that silence I watched my son with the careful eyes of a father who had seen him grow from a boy into a man. But what I saw before me now was neither boy nor man, but a figure unraveling beneath the weight of truth, for this was the moment when shock gripped him, when the walls of arrogance he had built so high came crashing down in a storm of disbelief. His face, once so full of smug confidence, drained of its color as though the blood had been pulled from his veins, and his mouth opened but no words came, only stammered syllables that carried none of the authority he had wielded so boldly in the weeks leading up to this day. His eyes darted wildly from the lawyer to me, from the documents to the faces of the relatives, searching desperately for some sign that this was not real, that it was some cruel mistake, that his imagined inheritance had not just slipped beyond his grasp. But every gaze he met confirmed the same truth, for the lawyer remained firm, the relatives looked away in quiet judgment, and I sat calm and steady, watching him with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. He leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to compose himself, but his wife's whispers betrayed his panic, her voice sharp in his ear as she urged him to fight, to say something, to reclaim the control he had lost. And yet all he could manage was a weak protest that sounded more like a plea than a demand. He said it was unfair, that he had been misled, that as my only son he deserved more. But his voice cracked on the word deserved, and I knew that in his heart he could feel the weight of his own failure pressing down upon him. The relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some whispering to one another, others shaking their heads, and though no one spoke loudly, the air was thick with disappointment, not in me, but in him, for the arrogance they had once tolerated now stood exposed as baseless pride. I watched as he tried again to rally, his fists clenching, his jaw tightening, but the strength was gone from his voice, the certainty stripped away, leaving only a hollow echo of the man he thought himself to be. His shock was not only at the legal reality of the hidden house, but at the collapse of the image he had crafted for himself, the image of a triumphant heir stepping into wealth without effort, and now that image lay shattered before him. I could see the storm within his eyes, anger battling disbelief, pride battling humiliation, and beneath it all the faint glimmer of a realization he did not want to face, that his greed had blinded him, that his arrogance had led him here, that he had underestimated the resolve of the father he dismissed as weak. His wife clung tighter to his arm, her own face pale and drawn, and I wondered if in that moment she too realized the truth, that her influence had pushed him further into arrogance, but could not shield him from consequence. My son looked at me then, his eyes searching, perhaps for anger, perhaps for mercy, but I offered neither, only the calm steadiness of a man who had fulfilled his duty, who had made his choice, who had honored his promise. The shock lingered on his face, each second carving it deeper, until he no longer looked like the man who had walked into that office so boldly, but like a child stripped of his illusions, exposed before the family he thought would cheer his triumph. It was a sight both painful and necessary, for though it pierced me as a father, it also confirmed that the lesson had begun, and no matter how long he raged against it, the truth could not be undone. The moment of shock did not linger in silence for long, for as the weight of the documents settled fully upon my son, his disbelief flared into anger, and it was then that the confrontation I had long anticipated erupted, not with fists or shouting at first, but with a storm of accusations and demands hurled across the polished wood of the lawyer's table, each one more desperate than the last. And yet through it all I remained seated in calm resolve, for I had known this day would come, and I had prepared myself for it in every way a man can prepare. My son rose from his chair, his voice trembling at first, but quickly gaining force, as he accused me of betrayal, of scheming against him, of dishonoring the bond between father and son. And though his words were sharp, They cut only himself, for the truth of his greed stood naked before everyone present. He pointed to the lawyer, claiming manipulation. He pointed to the relatives, claiming conspiracy. And finally he pointed to me, his voice breaking as he declared that I had stolen from him what was rightfully his. His wife joined in, her voice dripping with venom wrapped in feigned civility, saying that no good father would deny his own child, that no good man would withhold from the family that carried his blood. But her words rang hollow against the silence of the room where every eye had already seen the truth for what it was. I let them speak. I let their anger pour forth unchecked, because I knew that their fury only revealed the depth of their greed. And when at last the room grew heavy with their shouting, I lifted my hand slightly, and the silence that followed was sharper than any blade. In that silence, I spoke. Not loudly, but firmly. My voice calm, my words deliberate, telling him that what he called betrayal was in truth protection, that what he called dishonor was in truth loyalty, that the house he sought so greedily was not a prize to be handed over, but a legacy to be safeguarded. I told him of the nights his mother and I had worked until our bodies ached, of the debts we had paid, of the meals we had skipped, of the countless sacrifices he had never seen. And I said that to hand over that house to a man who saw only numbers and not memories would be to betray everything she had stood for. My words struck him harder than any shout could have, for they did not rise with anger but fell with truth, and I saw the flicker of pain in his eyes as the family around us shifted uncomfortably, their gazes no longer soft with sympathy, but sharpened with judgment. He tried to interrupt, his voice strained, but I pressed on, telling him that respect cannot be demanded, that gratitude cannot be forced, that love cannot be bought, and that until he learned those truths he would never be worthy of what he so desperately sought. The confrontation was not about property alone. It was about every moment of dismissal, every careless demand, every selfish act that had brought us here, and as I spoke the words he had never wanted to hear, I felt the burden of silence lifting from my shoulders. My son's face flushed with anger. His hands clenched, but his voice faltered. For deep within him he knew that what I said was true, and though his pride would not let him admit it, the room itself bore witness to his arrogance laid bare. His wife tugged at his arm, urging him to leave, but he remained frozen, his chest rising and falling with the force of his humiliation. And in that moment, I knew the confrontation was not just between father and son, but between truth and greed, between memory and entitlement, between the love that built a legacy and the arrogance that sought to consume it. And though the air was heavy, though my heart ached with sorrow, I felt a calmness settle over me, for I had spoken the words that needed to be spoken, and nothing he could say or do would ever undo the truth that had been revealed. The confrontation left the room in uneasy silence, but silence has a way of revealing truths that words cannot hide. And in that silence, I saw the first cracks in my son's arrogance deepen into a collapse that he could not stop, for the relatives who had once whispered his name with approval now shifted away from him, their eyes heavy with disappointment, their voices hushed with judgment, and I knew then that this was the moment when the pedestal he had built for himself crumbled beneath his feet. He had entered the lawyer's office, certain that he would walk out a victor, confident that he would be the man to whom everything was handed without question. But now he stood exposed, his demands echoing with emptiness, his accusations falling flat, his certainty stripped away until nothing remained but the raw sting of humiliation. His wife tried to salvage his pride, whispering to him, tugging at his arm, urging him to speak again. But he could not form words that would change what had been revealed, for the law was written, the document sealed, and the truth undeniable. The relatives began to murmur, some shaking their heads, others looking down at their hands, ashamed for him rather than with him, and each murmur chipped away further at his pride. I watched him, my heart heavy with sorrow, for though I had steeled myself for this moment, I could not escape the truth that he was my son, the boy I had once carried on my shoulders. The young man I had once dreamed would honor the sacrifices made for him, and yet here he was, crumbling before me not because of what I had done, but because of what he had become. His arrogance had led him to boast, to declare, to demand, and now that arrogance turned on him, leaving him hollow and broken in the eyes of those whose approval he once sought. He tried once more to speak, his voice low, his words stumbling, saying that he had only wanted to take care of the family, that he had only wanted to honor his mother's memory. But the weight of his earlier arrogance made those words sound false, and no one in the room believed him. Even his wife's face betrayed a flicker of doubt, a crack in her own certainty, for she had encouraged his pride but had not expected its collapse. And now she looked at him not with triumph, but with unease. I sat still, offering no gloating, no triumphant smile, for I knew the fall of arrogance is punishment enough, and I had no need to strike him further. The lawyer closed the folder and gathered his papers, signaling that the matter was concluded, but my son remained frozen, staring at the table as though it might offer him escape, his shoulders hunched, his eyes burning with shame. The relatives began to leave in quiet clusters, their footsteps echoing in the hall, their voices low as they spoke of what they had seen, and I knew that word of this day would spread through the family, not as a story of inheritance, but as a story of arrogance undone. My son looked at me once more before leaving, his face twisted with anger and humiliation, but beneath it all, I saw the flicker of something else, perhaps recognition, perhaps regret, though pride would not yet allow him to show it. He left with his wife trailing behind him, her hand on his arm, her whispers sharp, but her eyes avoiding mine, and the room felt lighter once they were gone, as though the weight of his arrogance had finally been lifted. I remained seated for a while, letting the quiet wash over me, letting the truth of what had transpired settle into my bones. The fall of arrogance is never gentle. It shatters illusions and exposes weakness. And though it broke my heart to watch my son suffer such a fall, I knew it was the lesson he had brought upon himself. He had believed himself untouchable. Yet now he knew he was not. And that knowledge, more than any words I could have spoken, was the beginning of his reckoning. When the dust of that day finally settled, and the relatives had gone their separate ways, leaving only the faint echo of their footsteps and the weight of silence in the lawyer's office, I sat alone for a moment and let the truth of all that had happened wash over me, and it was then that I found peace not in triumph, but in the quiet certainty that I had done what was right. For the final word belonged not to my son, not to the whispers of family, not even to the papers that had been signed, but to me as a husband who had loved, a father who had given, and a man who had chosen to protect. I thought of my wife, of the journey we had walked together, of the sacrifices we had made, of the second house that had once been nothing more than a dream sketched on scraps of paper and had grown into a fortress of safety, and I felt her presence beside me, her hand in mine, her voice whispering that I had kept my promise. I thought of my son, of the boy he once was, of the man he had become, of the arrogance that had blinded him, and the fall that had humbled him, and though my heart ached with sorrow for the bond that had fractured, I knew that I had given him the greatest lesson a father can give, a lesson not of wealth but of respect, not of inheritance but of gratitude, not of entitlement but of humility. The second house remained mine, not as a treasure to hoard, but as a symbol of love and sacrifice. A reminder that what is built with devotion must be protected with equal devotion. And I knew that one day, when my own time ended, it would pass to hands worthy of it, whether his, if he changed, or to another who understood its value. But until then, it would stand untouched, a testament to the life we had lived. I walked slowly through my home that evening, my hand brushing the walls, my eyes resting on the photographs of a family once whole, and though grief still lingered, it no longer consumed me, for it had been tempered by resolve and softened by peace. I sat in her chair, the scarf she had left behind draped across the armrest, and I whispered to her that I had done it, that I had protected what we built, that I had honored her memory. And for the first time since her passing, I felt the weight in my chest lift, replaced by a calm warmth that spread through me like sunlight after a storm. The final word was not spoken in anger, not shouted in triumph, not carved into law, but carried in the quiet of my heart, a steady truth that needed no audience. My son would rage, he would sulk, he would perhaps one day reflect, but none of that mattered, for the truth had already been revealed and the lesson already delivered. The relatives would talk. They would retell the story of the day he walked into the lawyer's office certain of victory and walked out humbled, and in their retelling the truth would spread further than my voice ever could. Yet for me the story was not about his arrogance or his fall, but about the endurance of love, the strength of sacrifice, the power of quiet resolve. I closed my eyes and let the stillness embrace me, and in that stillness I felt her presence as strong as the day we first walked into our empty home with nothing but hope. I smiled then, not a smile of triumph, but of fulfillment, and I knew that whatever came next, I had done my duty. I had kept my promise, and I had spoken the final word not with my lips, but with my actions. And so the story ends, not with defeat but with peace, not with loss but with honor, not with greed but with love preserved, and that is a truth no arrogance can ever erase. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.